Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about documentation. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, when a new hire asks you questions that are answered by your team's documentation, would you answer the question or would you ask them to read the documentation and let them know you are happy to help if the docs don't clarify? Both. And my initial thought was, what documentation? Because I ain't never seen no documentation unless I'll pat myself on the shoulder, unless it's my team. My team has documentation, and that's because I wrote it. Anywho, no, I would say that I do both. I definitely have, because I have two main considerations when I'm in this sort of situation. So my policy around documentation is usually less is more, but that's not because I don't think that documentation is important. I think that the documentation that you do have has to be very important for you to maintain, because it is a maintenance, and if you have too much of it, it degrades quicker, if that makes sense, because things get out of date very quickly. And the way that I usually structure my documentation is as like tutorials or to-dos, like lists of things you should be doing, lists like references to different pieces of documentation. You can almost think of them as like, yeah, to-do list, like checklist, like do this, do that, etc., etc., etc. So the documentations that I usually write are just markdown files in the source, where there is a docs folder, and we write like guides for how to do certain things, how to release a production, how we do things, like what team values, etc., etc. Sort of all the things that you need to know in order to do, like, to get access to all the systems, in order to know how we usually do code reviews, in order for you to, like, basically all the things you need to know in order to be an effective part of the team. And that documentation is where we cap it. In other words, we don't add like fluff things if we can avoid it, because it is expensive to maintain all of this for us. Because I also have a policy, at least when I'm in the team, that we do monthly reviews, where you basically go through the documentation again and again and update it on a monthly basis. It's not something that just lives there. We have a reoccurring story for every month for it. And if it hasn't changed, you just put your name on the end of the file. We even have a little checklist writing the date you checked it, and that you testify with your name, that you just write your name and say that, yeah, I have checked this file, it's still up to date, the links are working, etc., etc. And that process keeps the documentation alive, it keeps it working, etc., etc. And the reason why I usually, depending on the nature of the question, if there is it's a cookie cutter, very simple question, it's something that I know for a fact that that's written in the documentation, I always say, go and read the documentation. The reason being behind that is because I want the people, like when I have new hires that join, the documentation that is written has been written to save us a lot of the onboarding time. Like we have onboarding guides, like where basically if you just read that entire file, you will learn almost everything that like all of it. You like all these standard questions, where is that, etc., etc. Almost all of it is in the documentation. And so if they're asking, it's better for them to just learn that, okay, yeah, start with that. If they start with that, a lot of because the onboarding process, if you don't have anything written down, you're basically locked into a few days, in a worst case scenario, and in some cases it can take longer than that, of holding people's hand for very simple things like, oh, who do I talk about this, about access, about this, about that, these standard like FAQ type of questions. And instead of sitting there holding their hand in that sort of situation, it's, in my opinion, better for them to sort of understand that, yeah, there's documentation for all that stuff. You can set all these things up yourself, and it also breeds a healthy respect for that we have documentation. And in my team, or like this team that we're working in, we care about the documentation we have, because what happens then is that creates consistency. It creates a commitment to because if the documentation is really good, it's sort of like tests. If you have shitty test coverage and you have shitty tests, nobody wants to maintain them and it degrades. But if you have good tests, usually people care about it. Same thing with the documentation. That's why it's very important, as I said, to not waste people's energy with documenting every single little thing and forcing them to read like a bible of shit that they don't need. That's why as I said, I create specific guides for specific tasks and like specific like checklists for how to execute everything, so that it becomes a reference documentation if you don't remember how to deploy something or how to do a certain thing or how a certain process works, etc., etc. It's just something to help you remind yourself the steps that are involved in doing a certain task. And then I usually name like the file after like what you're trying to do. How do I do this? So when it's sort of like the Google thing, you structure the names of the documentation so that it's easy to search for how you want to do something. It becomes our own little search thing, or like if that makes sense. But with that said, as I was saying, the goal is to create a high value documentation so that people know how and actually respect and like value it. The problem is that you can't document everything. It's very difficult to document every single little thing, and in some cases it's not possible to write documentation that is so clear that everybody's just going to understand it. And so it really comes down to, is the question that they're asking something that I know is documented, or something that is sort of cookie cutter? It's, as I said, it's a standard question or something like that. If that is the case, then I want them to go and read the documentation, because they're going to learn everything they need from reading that. But if it's something that I know that, no, actually this is going to be a little bit tricky for them to figure out, and it's also something that I know I can't really document that in an effective way, it's not gonna work. Like you can't like document some things that have certain nuances, or like, yeah, you should probably go and ask this person, and so forth and so forth. Then of course I will just answer them, because there's no hope for them to move forward, because that's the point, in my opinion. The point is to establish a way of working where people can make progress without a lot of overhead, because it's like being really anal about forcing people to document all the things. I don't believe in that, as I said, because all it does is that it inflates things to the point where, oh, I'm just going to put this out there. For those of you who have ever worked with Confluence or things like Notion or other platforms that are for documentation, how long did it take for you until the documentation that you had was so gigantic that it's basically just a jungle of stuff and nobody can find anything anymore? And how does that make, what usually happens in my experience when you get to that point is that people just stop using it, and then they go back to doing the thing that people will do. They ask questions, they ask for people who already know where the documents are, etc., etc. And this is what I tell people: when you document everything and you create too much bloat, people get a degrading sensation of value of the thing that you're trying to give them. So your documentation should be good, and therefore it's more healthy, I think, to have a hybrid situation where some things are complicated, very liquid, it's not worth documenting them, because you can't follow them in a ready fashion, or they change so often that it's pointless. And some things are like onboarding things, standard things like links and where things are, etc., etc., things that you want to use as a reference. That I basically always tell people, go and read that, because it's important that you understand that we write these things down, we keep them up to date, and so that the next time someone comes and asks you, you don't have to sit for their entire onboarding process and you just handhold them through. Because one part that's dangerous with that is that they now create a situation where everything that we know about our way of working exists in everybody's head, which makes alignment difficult, but it also is a time waster, because a lot of this stuff is you could have just written this down and then they would have their answer, and you don't have to block people. So what I want you to take away from this is that I do both. If someone asks me a standard question and I know we have that documented, I usually put effort into making sure that we have all the standard stuff documented in a clean and easy to follow fashion. I mean, we even do as I said, it's step-by-step guides with screenshots and everything, this is how you do all these sorts of things. And then I create specific guides for how to do specific things. And in some cases you reference other guides and so forth, where in the onboarding guide it's just a list. Here are the important links. Here are the dates that are important, like the meeting times, etc., etc. Here are the next steps, what you should be doing, the accesses that you're going to need to get, who you're going to have to connect with, etc., etc., etc. All those things are in one guide, and then there are other guides where you can follow all the steps for doing all of that stuff. so that it's easy to follow along with. But some things are difficult. Like it's easier to it's better to not document them, because it's not something where, you know, it's simply not worth writing down, because either it changes so often or it's very difficult to explain it in a way that is going to make sense to someone who's reading a piece of documentation. It's like the proportion of the investment is too high, and then I'll just answer the question. And I always try to make sure that even when you ask people to reference the documentation, I never use something like read the fucking manual or like these sorts of the terms, even though I find it sometimes annoying, because I know that they are reading a document where it says in the document. You try to be understanding in those situations and just say, yeah, I think it's on this line, and you actually you give them the reference to where it says so in the document instead, because I think it's important that if you want to have well-working documentation, you have to make people commit to it, if that makes sense. And that is one part, that the documentation is good, not too complicated, not bloated or anything like that, and that you have a way of keeping it a healthy by like continuous reviews or something like that. Because documentation who nobody cares about, or like where like it's in a shitty state, it's just a matter of time before all of it is unusable. Have a great day.